everybody, happy Thursday. Now today we're going to talk a little bit about trauma. But before I jump into that, are you new to my channel? Welcome! I put out videos on Mondays and on Thursdays, so make sure you're subscribed and have those notifications, that little bell, turned on so you don't miss out. But let's jump into this question. Katie, does abuse always lead to trauma? And if the abuse does end, can you suddenly develop trauma years after? I thought this was a great question, and first let's start by defining trauma. And trauma is a deeply distressing or disturbing experience. And just to be clear, in order for someone to be traumatized, they must encounter an upsetting situation and become so upset that it leads to serious emotional problems, and therefore can cause them to suffer emotional trauma. I have an entire video about what it is and what it means to be traumatized, so you can click the link in the description to check that out. But now into this specific question. Abuse does not always lead to trauma, because we all have differing levels of resiliency, which really just means that we all have different support systems and levels of self-confidence. Resiliency overall means that it's our ability to push through things and be quote-unquote resilient in life, meaning overcome and push forward. And if we have enough support, we can process through all that's happened. So if we were abused, if we had a ton of people around us to talk about it, we were in maybe groups of other people who'd been abused, and we could, not feel alone and know that what happened wasn't our fault. Because overall, if we have enough support in our lives, we can process through all that's happened and stop the trauma from causing us any more distress. And just as not all trauma leads to having PTSD, because remember, in order to have PTSD, we must meet the criteria and not only witness or hear of a traumatic event, but then we also have to have recurrent involuntary distressing memories or dreams of it as well, meaning like we can have flashbacks or all of a sudden wake up from a nightmare of it happening again or dissociate as a result. So even if we've been through something that was life-threatening and completely traumatizing, that doesn't mean that we'll have PTSD. So you can see that just because something bad happens to us, that doesn't mean that it A, leads to a certain diagnosis like PTSD, or B, that it's gonna be so distressing that it affects us for the rest of our life. And so to answer that first portion of our question, does abuse always lead to trauma? The short answer is no. A lot of it depends on us, the situation, how much support we have, and all of that good stuff. Now the second portion of the question, if the abuse ends, can you suddenly develop trauma years later? The answer is yes. We are learning more and more about PTSD and trauma, and we find that it can take years for the symptoms to present themselves. But as far as the DSM goes, it doesn't really say. It just states that our symptoms must be present for at least 1 month. And they even have added this caveat at the end after all the diagnostic criteria about having delayed onset. And meaning that if some of the symptoms were present, but we didn't fully meet the criteria for PTSD until at least 6 months after the event took place, we could later be diagnosed with PTSD delayed onset. So the fact that they even have this as an add-on means that most people meet the criteria within the first 6 months of an event happening, but not all of us. So you can feel the event, you can have PTSD at any time, I believe, following a traumatic event. I also believe that our PTSD symptoms or trauma symptoms can be delayed because it's not safe yet, meaning that our brain doesn't feel it's okay to come back and talk through it because we're still kind of at risk. And our brain isn't ready to process anything until it feels like we're completely safe. That's why we actually have flashbacks and nightmares, all of things like that, because it's our brain's way of saying, I think it's safe and I think I'm ready to talk through it. I've talked about Inside Out and the marbles of memories, and trauma memories are when the marbles shattered all over the place. And if our brain's not ready for us to deal with it, it can kind of sweep all those bits off to the side, like stuffing it down, right? So we don't have to deal with it. But when it thinks it's ready, it picks up a little splinter and reminds us of it and says, hey, and that's what those flashbacks are. It's kind of our brain saying, I think we're safe enough emotionally to talk this out now. It could also be delayed, I believe, because we aren't doing well enough emotionally to work through it. Trauma work is really, really hard. And if we aren't ready to even talk about it, we can just work harder and harder to keep it all stuffed down. I've also had patients who didn't even feel any symptoms of the trauma or PTSD until some of their repressed memories were brought to light. So just know that everybody's going to be different. Be patient, because it's your process and no one else's. And there are also many, many treatment options available for trauma. So if you're watching this video and you have been through a traumatic experience and you feel like you might be struggling with symptoms of PTSD, there's EMDR, There's trauma therapy, somatic experiencing, talk therapy, medication, because SSRIs and SNRIs are the most common for PTSD, but there are many other options out there. And I will link in the description my whole playlist so it tells you what post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD is, what those treatment options I talked about mean, and just to make you more aware so that you feel empowered to make a positive choice for your own recovery. This video has been brought to you by the Kenyans on Patreon. If you would like to support the creation of these mental health videos, click the link in the description and check it out. I hope you found that helpful, but as always, leave in the comments down below. What do you think? Did you have delayed onset of PTSD symptoms? Why do you think that happened? Let us know in those comments down below, and I will see you next time. Bye.